The origins of all black people come from Africa, a Pan-African ideology. In the mid 1500s, Charles V of Spain tried to enforce the new laws of 1542 that were meant to protect indigenous people from being enslaved in Spanish America. But when colonists there resisted, he decided to start enforcing these protections at home in Spain itself, especially in the city of Seville, where many indigenous people from the Americas were kept as slaves. When it became clear to Charles V that resistance to the implementation of the new laws in Spanish America would be formidable, he decided to begin at home in Castile. In Seville, inspections that occurred in 1543 and 1549 resulted in more than 100 indigenous slaves being freed. In the plethora of lawsuits that ensued, generally initiated by disgruntled slave owners, witnesses, especially those of indigenous heritage, pointed to this period as transformative. Although Indios justifiably feared the repercussions of stepping forward to petition for their freedom, many did so, and the word spread quickly among Indios living throughout Castile. But it was rarely easy or straightforward, and litigants were beaten, branded, and sold. The stakes were high for both master and slave. Thus, the courtroom became a site where Indios and masters purposefully manipulated descriptive physiognomic categories and abstract notions of belonging in their attempts to fix Indios as perpetual slaves or to liberate them from decades of bondage. Determining their status was rarely straightforward, and it took years for protective legislation to be implemented seriously and systematically in Castile. Faced with increasing legal restrictions after 1542, slave owners in Castile developed two strategies that aided in identifying their Indios as slaves. The first was to argue that their Indio slaves did not in fact originate from a domain under the control of the Indies of the Ocean Sea of the King of Spain. Rather, they were Portuguese vassals who were by law still considered slaves even after the political unification of the Iberian Peninsula in 1580. The second line of attack was to emphasize the lineage of a slave over his or her birthplace. This meant that in some cases, Indio litigants were being asked to prove that their mothers were not of Moorish or North or West African heritage, because slave owners generally did not have documents to prove that slaves had been captured in just war. So, what happened? Inspections in Seville from 1530 and 1549 found many indigenous slaves being held illegally. As a result, over 100 indigenous people were freed. This encouraged others to come forward to petition or sue for their freedom, even though doing so was dangerous. Slave owners fought back in court trying to prove their slaves were still legally enslaved. So, how could you prove where you were from with no documents? Many court cases revolved around where someone was from and what their ancestry was because that affected whether they could be legally enslaved. To keep their slaves, owners used two main arguments. The geography argument, they claimed that their indigenous slaves were not from the Spanish lands, the Indies of the King of Spain, but from Portuguese territories, and that made them legally enslaved under Portuguese law. Or the ancestry argument. They claimed that the slaves had African or Moorish ancestry, which in their view made them enslavable. Meanwhile, indigenous people had to prove that their mothers were not African or Moorish, something that was very hard to do without written records. The importance of genealogy. Freedom depended on proving details of birthplace and bloodline. Masters and slaves both manipulated racial and ethnic categories to win cases. Even though the new laws promised protection, it took many years before Spain enforced them properly, and many indigenous people continued to suffer and fight for freedom. Coincidence? Final inspections in Seville were in 1549. Negro, 1550s, a member of the black-skinned race of Africa, from Spanish or Portuguese, Negro, black, from Latin, nigrum, Black, dark, sable, dusky, applied to night sky, a storm, the complexion, figuratively, gloomy, unlucky, bad, wicked. According to Devon, a word of unknown etymology. According to Watkins, perhaps nuke night. The Latin word also was applied to the black peoples of Africa, but the usual terms were Aethiops and Afer.